Okay, let me just get my screen up here. So we go from passenger cars to freight cars. When I originally put this show together, I was envisioning being in a room with people. And one thing I always like to start out with is to ask what era people are modeling, and I won't be able to ask that this time. But I always go on the assumption that most people are modeling the 1950s, either early or late. The transition from steam to diesel seems to be very popular. So a lot of this presentation is geared around that presumption, but it's not necessarily a requirement. So let me go ahead here. Okay, so always like to start out by just saying thanks to people who contributed, mainly sources of photos. Seth Lakin helped me out, and it's a really useful thing to look at the two-part article by Lansdale back a very long time ago, covering the evolution of the New York Central Oval. That's a very handy reference. So today's topics, I'm going to go over a brief history of the New York Central and how the subsidiaries fit together. I'm not going to be covering the 19th century. The focus is on freight cars and on understanding the evolutionary changes. There won't be a learning evaluation at the end, but you should gain an understanding of how to know how paint and lettering features are appropriate for models in your fleet for your era of choice. So the Vanderbilt Empire, most of the modern New York Central had been assembled at the beginning of the century. So you have all these components which were still separate companies, subsidiaries under the Vanderbilt Empire, which actually didn't have a corporate name yet, as far as I know. They were just various companies owned by members of the Vanderbilt family. So some things happened, obviously, in the 20th century. We had the merger of the New York Central and Hudson River with the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern. That was in 1914. The acquisition of the Toledo and Ohio Central and many subsidiaries, such as Hocking Valley, I'm not quite sure about that, Zanesville and Western, et cetera. There a lot of stuff happened there, which I'm not going to get into. The next important thing that happened was the integration of rolling stock numbering in 1935. And this was a system-wide renumbering with the exceptions of Michigan Central, which came a few years later, and Boston Albany, which came after the war. Some subsidiaries continued separately all the way into the PC era. And I'm not going to talk about after the merger. Pittsburgh and Lake Erie is probably the one that has the most action going on after the PC merger. Canada Southern, Peoria and Eastern, and Indiana Harbor Belt, which was joint ownership with other railroads, mainly Milwaukee Road, but it was more than that. So these subsidiaries, you had the nickel plate, which the New York Central owned. A lot of people forget that or don't know it. It was divested by order of the ICC in 1916. I'm not sure why I'm showing 1917 here. I had made some adjustments to this, but they're not showing up. Lake Erie and Western was divested to the nickel plate in the early 20s, I think 1922 to be exact. Cincinnati Northern was merged into the Big Four in the 1920s. Chicago, Indiana, and Southern was merged into the New York Central in 1950. And the Rutland was wholly owned by the New York Central for a brief time in the early 20th century, and after 1911 jointly owned between the New York Central and the New Haven until 1950, when the New York Central divested of any interest in the Rutland. So, talking about freight cars, Early on, it appears that no freight cars received a predecessor or subsidiary herald or logo after the adoption of the New York Central Line's oval, which was about 1905. Much later, many freight cars, P&LE and the Peoria and Eastern, began receiving slogans. This is late 50s and later than that. The SERS, the Steel Centers, and Quicker via Peoria. No significant deviation from the parent road's New York Central Herald. There's some minor exceptions to that, which is it's a deviation, but it's not a significant deviation. So we'll get to that. Okay, so late in the game, and I'm saying like late 60s, just before the PC merger, they revived the Boston Albany reporting mark. I'm not sure what the reason for that, but it probably had to do with car accounting or helping clerks to segregate a certain fleet of hopper cars. So you see a lot of photos of some triple hoppers with B&A reporting marks without the name Boston Albany spelled out. Those are cars that got relettered from New York Central to B&A in about 1967. And lots of those survived into Conrail in that appearance. The TOC reporting mark was revived by Penn Central. I believe it was a financial maneuver so that the leaseholder on the cars would have protection from the fact that Penn Central was bankrupt. And Toledo and Ohio Central was still a paper subsidiary that was not bankrupt. So, all right. So some roads were divested or merged earlier than 1935. So the Rutland, as I said, was half divested to the New Haven in 1911. The Nickel Plate, that was 1916. Lake Erie and Western, 1922. Toledo and Ohio Central was merged in the early 20s, and likewise the Cincinnati Northern by the mid-20s. And here's the Rutland, just as an illustration. And you can see this car is substantially the 40-foot, 40-ton car, New York Central design, built in large numbers, many thousands of cars just before World War I for New York Central and subsidiaries. However, the Rutland's 500 cars were built in 1924, nearly identical design. The only variation was the corrugated ends. As you can see in this picture, there's 6 ribs on the top and 8 in the bottom, where all the New York Central cars were 7/7, except for a small number of Cincinnati Northern cars also built in 1924. They were also 6/8. The other thing that you can see, which I think I can use my cursor to point to that, right here, this gusset is elongated. On the New York Central cars, they were an equal 45-degree angle. So that's a slight difference. Other than that, these cars were pretty much the New York Central design. Okay, nickel plate. So here's a nickel plate car built to the New York Central standard in 1916. It's a 36-foot car. These were about the last 36-foot cars built. They also happen to be the last new box cars before the New York Central divested of the nickel plate. They were never renumbered before divestiture, and most likely never had a New York Central oval applied, and I do not know what the reason for that would have been. You see many builders' photos of other subsidiaries had the New York Central oval applied. So this one, I don't know why. Now, Lake Erie and Western, these two photos are not of the same class of cars, so don't try to transfer anything there. But you can see the Lake Erie and Western car, the older photo with the New York Central Lines oval herald, and then a 1930 photo of a car still in the paint and lettering that was applied when it was a New York Central subsidiary, but you can see the rectangle where it says Nickel Plate Road that's been painted over the New York Central lined oval. So, you know, other than the change from New York Central to nickel plate, this car is substantially what it would have looked like when it was a subsidiary of the Central. So all the Roman lettering and the arrangement of stenciling is substantially what would have been the New York Central standard of the time. Okay, Toledo and Ohio Central. This is the USRA double sheath car as designed for the USRA. These were the last new boxcars lettered for the TNOC, and they were renumbered into the New York Central number series in the early 20s. And all of the TNOC cars were gone from the registers by 1930. So, you know, this is a nice looking car, and you can see the stenciling is consistent with World War I era. Now we get into the 1920s. Here's a Cincinnati Northern car to the spec 486. This is the all steel design, which New York Central and subsidiaries had tens of thousands of these cars. So this is a very significant car, many different lots. Cincinnati Northern got a few hundred of these. I don't remember the exact number. These, again, were the last new box cars that were lettered Cincinnati Northern. They were renumbered into Big Four by the early 30s, and then in 1935 renumbering got New York Central numbers. A handful of them, though, remained with the NOR reporting marks and the 4-digit numbers right up until 1950. You can also see, I've kind of glossed over this, the S prefix on the number. This was a practice the New York Central engaged in from the early 20s to the end of the 20s. It had to do with accounting for car repairs and also for routing of empty cars, but it was deemed no longer needed by the end of the 20s. So if you see a car of any car type with an S prefix, that means it was lettered that way in the 1920s. So, you know, most freight cars would get repainted probably about every 10 years, some more frequently than that. So it would be unusual to have a car with an S prefix much past the beginning of World War I, or World War II, I'm sorry. Okay, so the general renumbering in 1935, all freight cars were subject to the renumbering with the asterisk exceptions, with discontinued subsidiaries integrated into the New York Central series. So these subsidiaries that kept going were not included in this renumbering. Boston, Albany, Canada Southern, Michigan Central, Peoria and Eastern, and the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. But the main thing is all the remaining other subsidiaries, the Big Four, the Cincinnati Northern, the Toledo and Ohio Central, any cars that were still in a prior number series began to be remarked with NYC reporting marks and a new number in almost all cases. And we'll get to some details of that later. And a handful of cars appear to have survived into the early 50s, maybe. Hard to say. And again, the end of the S prefix. And almost simultaneously with the renumbering, the change in the oval from New York Central lines to New York Central system. This was not absolutely simultaneous, and I don't understand why, because it would have made sense. Anyway, that's the way it is. So here's the car. Yes?
Could you please move your cursor out of the middle of the slide? Thank you.
Oh, sure. You're welcome. So in 1935, these renumberings. So here's an example of spec 914 cars. This car is 1,000 cars built for the Big Four in 1928. And these are taller than the spec 486, but otherwise a very similar design. And they have the end doors. So the photo is probably early 1930s. Don't know exactly when it is, but it's very likely the as-built paint job. Has the New York Central lines in the oval. It's got a black background in the oval. You can see the reporting marks. CCC and St. L have all the periods in them. It's got the S prefix. And the way the dimensional data is configured is consistent with the late 1920s. So presumably, even though it's not when the car is new, it's still the as-built paint scheme. And then just a sliver of a photo, because the subject of the photo was not the New York Central 203333, but the car happened to show up. That's a car from the same lot, 578 or 585, after being renumbered from Big Four to New York Central. So that's the only photographic view that I can show you of a car renumbered. And you can see the number is a completely different series. There's no periods in the reporting marks. You've got the stencil lines above and below the reporting marks and number, and dimensional data is changed to the then current AAR standard. And as you can see, in April 1946, there were only 18 cars left that were in the register under the CCC and St. L reporting marks. 946 out of those 1,000 cars had been renumbered into the New York Central 203,000. So there's an example of a car that would have been commonly seen from the time they were built right up into the end of the 50s probably, but very few cars still Big Four after World War II. And here's an example of a car. I think this is a pretty nice paint job by a model railroad club. This is in a recent issue of RMC in their new products announcements. And, you know, I encourage you, if you like the paint scheme, give the club your support, buy the car for them. But they did a nice lettering job of the as-built paint job with all the 1920s lettering, except the oval should have a black background. But the car shell is a 1950s design car that is completely inappropriate. So this is a good example of why this clinic, I got the idea to do this, is to just give people a heads up to watch out for stuff that's out there and to be aware of how to make your eras be consistent. Okay, so in the change from lines to system, here's the August 1935 drawing, which was not superseded until 1955. So all your freight cars that are lettered, well, I should say box cars. I will cover other freight cars. Box cars lettered from 1935 until 1954 and into early 55 should have this oval logo, which is 48 3/8 inches wide. And the only difference from before is changing the word lines to system. So there's a lot of longevity to the New York Central oval in this style. Okay, so here's, I'm including this because this is another one of these modeler's traps. Panel side rebuilds of USRA hoppers. Nice looking car, it's attractive. Models are available in many different scales. The model on the upper photo happens to be an S scale model. And here's something with hopper cars. When you see a hopper car with a number in a series 300,000 or 400,000, that's the pre-1935 renumber. So after 1935, this car would have a different number, most likely in the 800,000. Likewise, the prototype photo, the Big Four car, that car would have been renumbered next time it got repainted after 1935 into a New York Central series in the 800,000. And in this particular case, I picked these cars because it just so happens the S-scale model is a model of lot 387H. 3 cars were rebuilt with a panel size. This was, like a demonstration to see how these panels worked in 1933. And the 3 cars were renumbered to be 850,000 in 1935. The big 4 cars were also part of a similar, let's try these out. 3 cars were rebuilt in 1935. So just before the renumbering and the change of the oval from lines to system, 3 cars were done with the big 4 lettering. Then in 1935, the renumbering comes and you introduce the New York Central 850,000 series, of which there were only 6 cars, which were these two groups of 3 each. And as you can see, the data from the 1946 official register, there were no cars left in the earlier original schemes, and all 6 cars were in the 850,000 series. So that's an example of something that, there's models out there in both the Big 4 scheme and the New York Central scheme. If you're modeling post-war, not really appropriate. Okay, so Michigan Central, I don't know why they were not included in the 1935 renumbering, but it's clear from the migration of numbering that they started being subsumed into New York Central about 1940. So here's an example of gondola. This is a builder's photo, built in 1922. The renumbering would have begun in 1940, and by 1946, only 6 years later, 8 cars still in Michigan Central and 12 in New York Central. And the reason those numbers are low, because the lot should have 49 cars in it, but there's only 20 accounted for in this number series, is because gondolas got a lot of reconfiguration. You can see, I picked this photo because you're looking down into the car. This car has drop doors in the floor. Many cars got reconfigured where they eliminated drop doors, and if they had wood floors or steel floors, they might have gotten different number series. So gondolas are complicated. But I just wanted to show this as a car that was Michigan Central, and you can see the migration in the numbering from NC to NYC. Here's another Michigan Central car, another of the Spec 486 taller version, built in 1926. And you can see this renumbering was not going rapidly. In 1946, there were still 292 of the 1,000 cars in Michigan Central, 12 cars in New York Central. And again, the reason there's way fewer than 1,000 cars is because I believe many of these cars were also put into pool service, probably for auto parts service. And that's a whole other story that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but suffice to say, when cars are put into pool service, they may have only lasted in that pool for a year or so, and then would come back to either their original number series or go into a different pool. And tracking the pools is something I have not tackled yet. So it's hard to account for how many of these original 1,000 cars really did exist. Okay, so in 1944, for reasons that probably have to do with inventorying black paint, they changed the oval by eliminating the black background. And this practice continued until the end of Gothic lettering in 1955. So what this means is, and this is important when you're looking at models and production models and also sets of decals you're considering using. Any freight car with no black background in the oval was painted between early 1944 and late 1955. That's it. And if they're painted before 1944, they should always have a black background. And there are errors in models in that regard as well. All right, so here's a little quiz. And if I had a room full of live people, you could check your boxes there. What do you think? Does this car have a black background, yes or no? And the answer is yes. But it's really hard to tell, and that's kind of the point of this fun little quiz, is that judging from photos is tricky and risky. Here's another one. This is a builder's photo. What do you think? Black background, yes or no? And the answer is no. This car is built, you might be able to read it on your screen, September 1944. So this is after the drawing revision was made to take the black out of the background. Okay, Boston and Albany. Now we're after World War II. And the B&A, I believe, was merged into the New York Central in 1950. And probably the most famous group of boxcars on the Boston and Albany were these 1,000 cars in the 50,000 series, lot 492B, built in 1924. And notice there's no oval. These cars were built without an oval. They never had an oval when they had the B&A reporting mark. So the merger occurred in 1950. They began to be renumbered into the New York Central series in the 38,000s. And by 1956, only 92 cars left B&A and 857 cars New York Central. So in terms of appearance compared to the car in the photo, just change the B&A to NYC, change the number series from 50,000 to 38,000, and probably with the same 3 digits as each individual car would get renumbered. And then that Boston Albany disappears, and the New York Central oval without a black background would be included. Okay, Canada Southern. Canada Southern probably was kept separate because it allowed Canadian assets to be accounted for separately. And one thing for sure is this facilitated intra-Canada shipments. The idea being that if you brought a U.S.-owned car across the border, there were rules on how long it could be in Canada before import duty would be charged and things like that. So they wanted to avoid all that. So for shipments that were shipped from a point in Canada to a point in Canada, better to have some cars that were Canadian accounted. So hence Canada Southern was kept with a fleet of cars. And this is a photo showing an example of that. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water here. Peoria and Eastern is kind of fun because they were a subsidiary way back before the oval began in 1905. And here's a car built right about that era, builder's photo with the New York Central Lines logo on it. That shows you how far back P&E goes. And they kept getting cars lettered independently for them. Here's the spec 486 cars that they got as built and later in life. So you see the S prefix and the as built. New York Central Lines, got a black background. And that all the data is consistent with standard practices in the 1920s. And you can see the later photo, which is 1958. Very similar car, same number series, or actually it's another lot of 100 cars, so it's an adjacent number series. Now you've got the dimensional data has been changed to the AAR practice that started in the 1930s. You still have Peoria and Eastern spelled out, but now you've got the stencil lines above and below, and the New York Central system on the oval. And depending on how old the paint is, if it's before 1944, that could have a black background. If it's after 1944, it should have no black background. And P&E cars kept being lettered into the cigar band era. Here's an example, and that's when the quicker via Peoria slogan came in. This car is probably painted in the early 60s because it has black ends and appears to be a black roof, and it's got the 12-foot wide cigar band herald. By 1964, they had gone to a much smaller cigar band herald, and they'd eliminated the black paint on the ends and roof. At least New York Central standard. Whether P&E did those things, hard to say. And then P&E lasted into Penn Central as a separate company. And this is a more modern car, but it still has the same number. It was not renumbered. And you can see they're using Penn Central style lettering on this car with the PC Worms logo. Just keep a note of that for later consumption. Now we're going to talk about Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. B&LE had a very large fleet of freight cars that served the steel industry. And what does that mean? It means open top cars, hoppers, gondolas, flat cars. They had a large number of cars, some of which you can see in this photo and also this one. And one thing I'd like to note, this is 1948. You can see New York Central ovals on many of the cars in the picture. In some cases, the weathering is so heavy, maybe it's there, but you can't see it. And you can also see in the background there a New York Central hopper with some pretty fresh paint. So again, P&LE was a subsidiary from before the beginning of the oval. And here's a builder's photo of a car with no oval because it was built before the oval came. And so this lettering is of its time, and even if this car survived very long, the lettering would have changed probably before 1910. I put this car in because there's a kit available in HO for modeling this. Is the USRA single sheath car rebuilt with steel sides. Tichy makes a kit in HO. Many people have built this. It's a pretty accurate model. They were rebuilt in 1934. And I don't know the exact story of the timing of Pittsburgh, McKeesport, and Youghiogheny as a P&LE subsidiary. The timing of when they decided to change from the P. Mickey to P&LE, but it was pretty quick. But some P. Mickey cars in this particular lot stayed in P. Mickey reporting marks as late as 1950. So that's interesting. But it's much higher number of them were going around with P&LE reporting mark. Okay, in 1955, there were many significant changes in the way freight cars were decorated on the New York Central. All the lettering on the car changed from Roman to Gothic, and the style of the Gothic on the slide is meaningless. The oval changed significantly. all the lettering changed from Roman to Gothic. And if you look at the image on the right, which is that drawing U57621, not only is all the lettering Gothic, but you can see they didn't paste over the stencil lines in all cases. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But the other thing is, this is very subtle. Besides the fact that the oval is about 6 inches wider, it's also a bit fatter, and the rounding of the curvature gets a little sharper at each end, left and right. So it kind of looks like a football. You might not notice that until it's pointed out to you, and then you can't not notice it. So it's really easy in any photo to tell just from the shape of the oval. Oh, was this car stenciled before or after 1955? Well, it's easy to tell. So the same oval was applied to Peoria and Eastern and Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. And this does apply only to box cars. Other cars, there's subtle variations, which I'm not going to delve into today, but I could at a later presentation. So here's a P&LE car. The upper photo happens to be, again, one of those USRA rebuilds, and it shows how it's been relettered from P. Mickey to P&LE. And that's a paint scheme that's appropriate to the post-war era. The reweigh date is 1954. This is what the car would have looked like in that time frame. The lower photo shows an AAR boxcar, but it's showing you the paint scheme that started post-1955, and the block lettering Pittsburgh and Lake Erie with the slogan "Service the Steel Centers" started about 1958. I don't have an exact date on that, but it clearly caught the attention of the photographer in 1959 to photograph this freshly painted car. And again, you can see that post-1955 oval is quite identifiably different from the older oval in the car in the upper photo. What am I doing for time? I guess I'm doing okay here. So here's some hopper cars that show you some variations. The upper car, so this is post-1955. It's got the Gothic lettering and the New York Central cigar band logo, but it's just a white stencil on a black background. As far as I know, only Pittsburgh and Lake Erie did this. And, you know, it was something that was not sanctioned by the parent road, but P&LE had some independence. But it obviously saved some money compared to doing the 3-color red, white, and black, which the regular cigar band would have said. On the lower photo, again, this is into the Penn Central era. You see the PC worms, but the lettering is still the New York Central era Century Gothic lettering. And I think that has to do with the fact that P&LE was much more independent of Penn Central than, say, the Peoria and Eastern was. I don't know the facts there, but we do know that P&LE survived the PC bankruptcy and became an independent railroad, where the Peoria and Eastern did not. And here's some covered hoppers which show the large block lettering, which was adopted. I'm not exactly sure when, but it was in the 60s, and some variations on the cigar band. These two cars are in the same lot, but the cigar bands are different. You can see the car on the right has the 3-color cigar band logo. Car on the left has just the black cigar band stencil on the gray background. Now, this is the one single most important slide of the entire presentation. And this is, I have to coin a new term. This is approximately exact. This graph is made by taking all of the entries in the official equipment registers over the time frame illustrated, ones that I've had access to. This is for boxcars only. So if a car series is shown in the register and it shows a number of cars, that's put into the data, and it's all tabulated and converted into this graph. What makes it a little fudgy is the numbers are plus or minus a dozen out of 100,000 because of the way I accounted for when they showed some cars listed but hadn't entered a number yet. My method of showing that was putting in a -1. So when I add up all these numbers, I didn't account for a handful of -1s. The other thing is the registers that I have are not in equal distribution in their dates. So, the x-axis on the bottom is shown in a regular number series, but the points in the graph should be proportioned differently. The point is, it gives you the gist of what's important. Now, there's some things to see here. One is, at the beginning in 1930, the total is nearly 130,000 cars. And then by World War II, we're down to 70,000. That's a cut of nearly half. Well, what's going on there? The answer is that in 1930, you had a lot of very old cars. And when the Depression came on, all those cars were gotten rid of. There was a famous incident on the Pennsylvania Railroad where they burned several thousand of their XL class boxcars at night. I forget where it was, somewhere, probably Altoona, and it made the news, obviously. I don't think there was a comparable incident on the New York Central, but all these older cars were very low capacity. Some were even 20-ton capacity, but most were 30 or 40-ton capacity. And they were being superseded by more modern cars that had 50 tons or more capacity. And they also were much smaller in cubic capacity. So even though the numbers go from 130 to 70,000, the capacity to carry load was not reduced that much, even though there was a large economic contraction during the Depression. Okay, so having explained that, you can see the New York Central reporting marks, the large area on top, was less dominant when you had the large subsidiaries in the 30s, and then became dominant in the post-war era, with the exception of Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. And Peoria and Eastern is in there, but it's so small, it hardly counts. And you can see Michigan Central and Big Four, as you would have expected, the numbers of cars declining in proportion to the parent New York Central. Until you get to about 1950, they're nearly all gone. And likewise, the Boston and Albany. One thing that's interesting is you can see where the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie is kind of a narrow sliver there about 1940. And the reason for that is because P&LE was not much of a boxcar railroad. It was all open-top cars until the 1950s. They started acquiring more boxcars because that's what market conditions called for. So you can see P&LE boxcars were a substantial presence right through the 50s and 60s. So again, this illustrates how if you find it attractive to want to have a subsidiary car, Michigan Central, Big Four, think about what era you're modeling, because if you're modeling after 1950, there's almost zero justification to having one of those cars. Now, that's a motivation for people to try modeling an earlier era. I don't know. Or maybe you're not that strict in your era as some people are, and that's fine too. But just to be aware that these are the historical facts. Okay, so just to say, New York Central System Historical Society is your resource. There's lots of drawings and photos. Look at the website, all kinds of good stuff going. And I'm open for questions.
Jeff, it doesn't look like we have any questions right now on YouTube. I have a non-boxcar question. I always see covered hoppers for the Central painted in gray. What kind of gray is that?
You mean the shade of gray?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is not something I've delved into, but I would say based on color photographs that I've been acquiring over the years, that it probably was not a single standard that they replicated consistently. Knowing all the pitfalls of, variations in photography and lighting and all that, you can argue all day. But it seems to me that there were some shades of gray that were very close to white, and some that had more of a medium gray that I don't think would be accounted for by those variations.
Okay. We do have a question from YouTube. Joe asks, when did PL&E locomotives lose the New York Central logo text and move to the large PL&E block lettering?
Well, I certainly don't know the answer to that, but I would guess that it happened in the 60s at the earliest. But I don't know.
I believe it was after the P&LE spun off of Penn Central.
Yes, which would have been, I think, at the end of the PC bankruptcy.
Yeah, 76 or shortly thereafter.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, because the PC, because they owned a large block of shares in the P&LE, the P&LE couldn't become completely independent till the PC bankruptcy resolved PC's ownership of those shares.
Doesn't seem like we have any other questions coming in from YouTube.
Very good.